Alright guys, Murph's here, and today I want to talk about this. A CZ52 chambered in 7.62 by 25 Tokarev. Now, in order to talk about this, we are going to have to talk about a little bit of history. Now, guys, it's been a little while since I reviewed a handgun that was actually historic. So with that being the case, it's probably going to be a little bit longer history section. If that's something that you're not actually interested in, I implore you to go ahead and check the description and jump ahead to whatever chapter you would actually like to pick back up on. As for the rest of us, let's go ahead and get into it. After the end of World War II and the beginning of the Cold War, there was a massive arms race. Now, a lot of times we have a tendency to think about that in terms of nuclear power. However, we also see it in the form of small arms. And really, regardless of how World War II ended, we were going to see a massive arms race because a ton of technology came out during World War II that was truly earth-shattering and groundbreaking. And it would be expected that militaries afterwards would want to more fully research a lot of this stuff in order to better develop what the future of warfare was going to look like. Now, of course, the Cold War being the way that it was, this period of arms expansion lasted much longer than it normally would. And in this case, we have two very strong parties. We have NATO and we have the Warsaw Pact. Now, both of these countries had a vested interest in creating an organization of people who had similar stuff, who had similar vehicles, weapons, ammunition, all that type of stuff, so that they could be interchanged and mutually supporting in the case of World War III. Seeing as we'd already gone through 2 world wars in the first half of the 20th century, you could see why everyone was kind of preparing for number 3, especially with communism and capitalism ready to go to blows. Now, with this being the case in the Soviet Union, which is where we're going to really focus here, a lot of people have a tendency to think that everything was just kind of dictated by Russia. And it kind of was, but there's a lot more nuance involved in this. We discussed this previously, actually, in my PSL 54C video, which if you're interested in that, go ahead and check for the link in the description. However, you had a couple of options now that you're in the newly formed Soviet Union, or perhaps you're looking to join the newly formed Soviet Union. You could either A, take on Russian military aid while Russia helps you set up your new manufacturing capabilities, and other people within the Warsaw Pact contribute to your economy so that you can set up manufacturing capabilities and get yourself online with everybody else much later. So you can start off with surplus arms, Tokarev rifles, Tokarev pistols, PPSH-41s, Mosin Nagants, all that kind of stuff. Eventually the SKS, depending on when it is that you join. Then you have the second option, which you could go ahead and take your manufacturing capabilities and start producing licensed copies of already existing weapon systems. And then you have your third option where you could develop something completely of your own variety. And this is actually one of the things that I love about CZ and Czechoslovakia at the time, countries now known as the Czech Republic of Slovakia, was that they were always a really big fan of homegrown designs. And they really resented being pulled into the Soviet Union, it would appear. Now, we talked about not only the company, Česká Zbrojovka, but also Czechoslovakia's rocky relationship with the rest of the USSR. And I don't necessarily want to get into that, but one of the things that I absolutely love about the Czech was that they were huge fans of being like, no, we want to do our own thing. And it really, really caused issues for everyone else around them. And another example of that being this handgun. There's a lot of other options that one day I hope to cover. We're just going to talk about the CZ52. I promise I won't go down the rabbit holes. So, they would develop this handgun in 1952, and it would initially be chambered in 9mm Luger. However, everyone else was like, look, bro, no one else is using that. Okay? We got rid of all the German surplus arms and put them into deep storage in case of World War III. We are looking for common calibers, rechamber that pistol. And rechamber it they did over to 7.62 by 25. This handgun would start production in 1952 with 200,000 guns produced before ceasing production. It would remain in service until 1982, when it would be replaced by the aptly named CZ82, which maybe you're seeing a trend here. They're very tricky in their naming conventions. Now, the proper designation for this would be VZ52, standing for Vzor, which would mean model. However, it's far more colloquial to refer to this as a CZ52, so that is what I'm going to call it. In fact, that's actually what's inscribed on the slide, so it's totally what I'm going to call it. Now, with the fall of the Berlin Wall, the ending of communism, all that kind of stuff, and the opening up of all of these Eastern Bloc countries, all of those countries would suddenly find that they were kind of cash-strapped, and they had massive storehouses of firearms that were never going to get used in World War III. So they opened those up and started selling them on the civilian market, with a lot of them coming to the United States. These handguns became very popular because they were very inexpensive and the ammunition was plentiful. Now, stores of these handguns have dried up. You see these in onesie twosies occasionally at gun shops, pawn shops, gun shows, or perhaps on the internet if someone happens to come across a batch of them. Now, when these handguns were surplused out, they were refinished over into this kind of grayish finish here, and they were rebarreled and maintained and all that kind of stuff before they were sold on the open market. Now, these have started to appreciate, which is one of the annoying things about a lot of former com-block weapon systems, is that people can remember when these guns were, as expensive as a Coca-Cola. However, times have changed. There's fewer and fewer of these handguns every year, and they have started to appreciate, because that is what guns do. That's what things do when there's fewer and fewer of them. When they become rare, they become more expensive. And these guns have definitely risen in price. All right, so there's history. Why don't we go ahead and start talking about the features of this particular handgun. Right off the bat, we have a 4.5-inch barrel, which is kind of on the low end, but still well within the expectations for a service-size pistol. Now, if you look at this, this looks like it's much longer than a 4.5-inch barrel, but that's just because we have this very stretched out overall design. Now, we have these fairly low profile sights, but I can tell you that they sit up higher than like a GI sight. Now, there's not a whole lot of contrast between the two of them. There's no serrations cut into them to help to reduce glare. There's not a white dot or anything like that, so they can be a little difficult to find on a dark background. However, they're fairly easy to pick up once you kind of get the presentation down for them. We'll talk about that more once we get to ergonomics. Now, of course, this is chambered in 7.62x25. However, you can find 9mm barrels for them, and they will come with springs specific for the 9mm. Now, something else that's interesting about this handgun is that this looks like it would be a blowback design. In fact, if you actually look at how the spring is wrapped around the barrel, that is indicative of blowback designs. However, it is not. It is actually a roller blowback delayed system, which is super cool. You don't often see this on handguns. This is one of the few examples that I can think of that have this as a feature. So we have an actual locking blowback design. That's awesome. And really, quite frankly, kind of necessary when you consider that the 7.62x25 is kind of a high pressure round. All right, now let me see if I can get this back together. It's a little bit of a pain if you've never done it. There we go. Now, something else here, you might have missed it, but these tabs are your pull-down tabs in order to be able to disassemble the slide. Our system is a single action only type operating system. We have an exposed ring type hammer. Now, one of the interesting things there is that we do have a passive rebound hammer, or a passive safety in the form of a rebound hammer, so that way the hammer is not resting against the firing pin. Now, further speaking about safety, our safety is located on this side of the gun. Down for fire, up for safe, and all the way up for decocking. Which is interesting. However, there's a couple things that you got to take into account with this. It's great that this has a decocker. However, an issue that you'll find on early decocker designs is that the springs were not necessarily the strongest. And you'll find this in the P38 as well. So ideally, there's supposed to be an interrupter that keeps the hammer from impacting the firing pin when you use your decocker. However, those can wear out. And there's not a real way to be able to tell that they wore out prior to dropping the hammer and finding out whether or not the gun's going to go bang. So a couple things that go along with that. One, maintain your firearm safety rules and make sure that the gun is oriented in the safe direction anytime you do anything that has to do with the hammer. And two, it might be worthwhile to invest in Wolf springs in order to be able to get those replaced, or replace those yourselves, get a gunsmith to do it, whatever makes you feel comfortable with that process. Now, in addition to that, when it comes to replacement parts, the firing pins on these were cast. This can be problematic if you're shooting a whole bunch of surplus 7.62 by 25 that was built to work with submachine guns and have harder primers. It could really diminish the amount of time that your firing pin is going to be good for. Fortunately, you can also find replacement parts for those, so it wouldn't be a bad thing to invest in, perhaps have a couple on hand if you're shooting this gun a lot. Now, looking at this, we do not have any type of external slide release. However, this gun does have a last shot hold open feature that is not dependent, like the magazine initiates it, but it's not like a last round follower is the only thing keeping it open like you would see in an AK. However, something that's very interesting is that we do have this lever here on the side, which is what is holding your bolt open right now, or your slide open right now. So you could feasibly press down on that in order to release it, and also press up on it in order to lock it into the rear position without a magazine. Now, of course, this is not something that's actually textured for that type of manipulation or anything like that. So I wouldn't recommend that your reload procedure be to rock in a new source of feed and then press down on that lever in order to release the slide. It would still be easier to rack the slide in whatever manner that you see fit. Slingshot, overhand, doesn't matter to me. Our trigger, let's go ahead and talk about this for a second. Our trigger has a little bit of take up before we hit the wall. It's a relatively heavy trigger. It's not the heaviest trigger that I've ever felt by any means. Our reset goes out beyond the wall, and then we have a little bit of pre-travel until we hit the wall again. Yeah, it's a relatively stiff trigger, but it's definitely not the worst single action trigger I've ever felt. It's not the best single action trigger I've ever felt. Keep in mind, guys, this is a service pistol. This is not a competition pistol. So this is not like a 3.5 pound trigger or something along those lines. Our grips are made of Bakelite, which is pretty typical grip material coming out of the Soviet Union especially. We have this spring clip here that keeps them on. I have heard some complaints that if you're not careful with taking this off, if you damage it, they are very difficult to replace and you're not going to be able to keep your grips on. Our our magazine release is located at the heel of the butt right here. See that right there, right in front of this lanyard loop, and removes our 8-round magazine. Now, something that's important to keep in mind, guys, is that this comes from a time where handguns were purely backup weapons. This was not some sort of suitable rifle substitute. It's not tactical in the manner we think of it today. So somebody would not go to war with like 8 of these magazines bristling out of their pockets. An officer would have this gun and an additional magazine. Officer, maybe an NCO, would have this gun and the magazine in the gun and an additional magazine. And the expectation was that he was going to put this into his holster or his pocket or something like that whenever he conducted a mag change, and then pull his additional magazine out of his holster and reload. There is zero expectation that he's just going to toss that thing in the mud outside of dire circumstances. The supply sergeant that he signed for that from is going to want it back. And a lot of times on these older handguns, the magazines were serialized to the handgun. So these were not expendable items. Got a little sticker on there. Anyway, so something to keep in mind there. Now, with the holster, you would, of course, have a pouch for the additional magazine, and then also a lot of times you will see a cleaning rod included. These handguns would have shipped with a holster and all that kind of stuff. When I bought this one, it did not come with it. I just got the gun and the magazine that came with it. I had to buy this stuff separately. All right, now let's go ahead and talk about this grip. We can see here that it's rather long. And that is because the 7.62 by 25 is kind of a long cartridge. And if you look at it, it almost looks like the bottom of the grip kind of kicks forward, like sweeps forward just a little bit. And with this hump back here, it kind of makes you grip it in that way, to where you feel like the bottom of your hand is kind of kicked out a little bit further forward than it would be normally on any other type of handgun, compared to a Glock, a 1911, any of the above. It definitely puts your wrist into kind of a weird position, but it's weird ergonomics, but it's not terrible. It's not the worst thing that I've ever felt. All right, guys, that's features. How does it shoot? Well, so I'm a little torn when it comes to shooting this handgun. I enjoy shooting surplus guns because it's shooting a piece of history, and it's history in action, and it's very interesting to me. However, this gun is not the most comfortable thing in the world to shoot, and a lot of that has to do with the placement of the safety. So I am used to having that kind of aggressive thumbs forward grip and all that kind of stuff whenever it is I'm shooting this handgun. However, with the 7.62x25 cartridge, this gun's got a little bit of bark, and that bark becomes bite whenever you consider the placement and shape of the safety. It kind of digs into my hand a little bit. So it almost becomes better to hold a little bit lower, but when you do that, the gun becomes more flippy, which makes follow-up shots a little bit more difficult. Now, of course, we're talking about a 1950s service handgun. Are we necessarily talking about going out there and doing ridiculous splits on a bill drill? No. It's just something that I noticed being a more modern shooter and a more tactically minded shooter. These are some of the things that you kind of face whenever it is that you consider this as a shooting option. Now, of course, 7.62x25 is an awesome little cartridge, though kind of difficult to find. We'll talk about that more another time overall. Yeah. Oops. Like I say, that lever is very difficult to get. I would not recommend trying to use that to do your slide releases if you were to run this in a more defensive type manner. Now, when it comes to reliability and all that kind of stuff, I have had a few issues out of this gun. Most of those, however, related to the magazine. The magazine that the gun came with, the floor plate was bent a little bit, so I had to spend some time kind of working on the geometry of this in order to properly feed and not have the magazine spring come shooting out of the floor plate, which was a little annoying. 7.62x25 is kind of expensive. I don't want that ammunition just rolling off on the range. All right, guys. That's shooting. What are my recommendations when it comes to this particular handgun? Would I recommend this for duty type use? Today, in the 2000s, absolutely not. This is incredibly outdated in a wide variety of reasons. We don't have a light rail or anything like that to be able to add a light. We have no optics cut. Our sights are not night sights, nor do they stand out. There's no white dots or anything along those lines to give them some contrast in order to make them faster to acquire. We have, and also fewer release magazines. I do not recommend this type of system on any type of duty type handgun. So yes, in a modern sense, this is a terrible, terrible duty type choice. Okay. Well, what about self-defense, home defense? Would you recommend it for that? Again, no. For home defense, I would not recommend it because we do not have light or, the sights type capability. For self-defense, I would not recommend it because of holster options. You don't have a lot. Now, between the two options, if you were to tell me that you're using this for home defense, while as much as I wouldn't necessarily agree with the choice, I would, it's not the absolute worst choice. It's just not that good of one, honestly. But it should be able to suit your needs. But for self-defense, not being able to have an effective holster really changes a lot of the dynamics here. To where something, this could be acceptable. What's the probability that you're actually going to have to use it to defend yourself? Pretty low overall. It's not that often people are getting into shootouts in town. However, just because you're not often doing it doesn't mean you shouldn't give yourself the best advantages. And this is not indicative of the best advantages, which kind of is a little bit of a blow to my younger self, because when I was looking at these handguns originally, when I was about 20 years old, planning out my first purchase, these were super cheap, so I was very tempted by them, especially since they have such a slim profile to them. They would be a great full-size carry option. That's what I was thinking. It's cheap and it's slim. It'll be a great, large handgun because I want to be able to carry the largest thing that I can reliably conceal. Now, standing back and reassessing that information with how I've developed as a shooter, this is a terrible choice. Magazines, the safety is not in the worst location at least, but comfort in shooting, modern practical type grip and all that kind of stuff, this is just not accommodating to those types of applications. So I would not recommend this for defensive type uses, be it home defense or self-defense. To each their own at the end of the day, but I can think of a lot of better options out of the market for that. What about as a competition handgun? Well, if you're doing some type of, military surplus, service-related shooting competition, then absolutely, I think this would be really fun, actually. But if you're talking about modern, like IDPA, USPSA, or whatever, IPSC, Doesn't matter. I would not recommend this handgun for those purposes. Low capacity, difficult to do the mag changes and all that kind of stuff. You're really limiting yourself a lot by trying to utilize this handgun for those purposes. You're going to have some very slow splits if you're actually trying to be competitive. What about as a hunting option? Now, in a lot of places, I would imagine that this handgun is not legal for hunting type applications, but as a defense against some varmints, it depends on how close it is that you're getting to those varmints. The 7.62x25 is an interesting cartridge, but it's also a very light projectile. And while it gets up to some pretty fantastic velocities, a lot of that is going to be very limited in penetration capability and expansion capability. So like trying to take this as bear medicine or something along those lines, probably not a good choice. Even though the velocities are high, the projectile is very light. If you're actually getting deep enough penetration to get the things that matter, you're not getting enough expansion to actually make them matter against something thick-skinned like a bear. So I can't really see a lot of applications for this as a woods gun, other than it would be fun to kind of take it out and plink at some logs or something along those lines. What are my uses for this handgun? Well, what I believe this fits best at any niche, and especially for me, is a surplus handgun, a piece of history. That is what I love about collecting surplus guns. This is somebody's service pistol at some point. There was an expectation that this would serve in World War III. And though it probably never fired a shot in anger, there's still so much history and intrigue associated with it for me. So, also, I think it has like really cool lines and a very, very individual appearance, and I really like that about it. All right, guys, I think that pretty much covers my thoughts on this particular subject. I hope you found this interesting, and that's pretty much what I got. Have a good day.